This event has been made possible by grants from the Alabama State Council on the Arts and the National Endowment for the Arts, a federal agency.
I am going to just go through the show briefly, not every picture, because I hope that you will all go if you haven't been already, but just sort of describe a little bit about what excited me about the different works in the exhibition. And people always want to know as well kind of why you chose something. And behind that question often is, why didn't you choose something else? And so there's a lot of factors that go into judging an exhibition like this. The first thing I want to say is really to echo what Warren said. It was an incredible response. I think there were 668 photographs submitted, which suggests that in a mere 3 years you've really built up this into something big, and I think it will continue to get bigger. And that's really exciting. And it's very exciting for me to be part of kind of just a very small help in this burgeoning photography scene in Montgomery. So I hope it continues. But that also meant that it was a very hard choice. I think fewer than 10% of the photographs. And I was really also struck by the quality of the work submitted, the interest. So when you have to make these hard decisions, you kind of fall back on certain criteria. The first thing to say is that photography is incredibly subjective. I have my own training and tastes, but what also happens, and it's pretty clear to me after I walked through the exhibition yesterday, is that whatever I'm engaged with at that particular moment in my work, in my thinking, tends to bleed into what I respond to. A couple years ago, I was working on portraiture, and I juried an exhibition, and I think it was 50% portraits. And I hadn't really thought of that as I was going through the works individually, but of course that's what happened. And I think here you'll see that two of the issues I've been really thinking about in my own curatorial work, one is really thinking about the South and the landscape of the South, both the cultural landscape as well as the physical landscape. And I'm working on a big exhibition, and it probably has to do with being a non-Southerner, coming to the South and trying to understand the artistic and cultural legacy. And then another issue that I've been working on is about domesticity and motherhood and sort of intimacy and labor, and how that's depicted in photography. So, as I walked through yesterday, clearly those are, I was drawn to works like that. And then, the other thing for me, and this is just how I think about photography, there are so many good photographers out there. I mean, really, it's a tremendous pleasure and challenge to be a photography curator. When we work for a museum, we make decisions based also on what works for the institution. I have a collection that I need to build on and expand in certain ways. We kind of set up parameters. When you're doing a show like this, you have a lot more freedom, and maybe in some senses fewer institutional responsibilities. But something that really, I think for me, is really drives what I respond to are works that are not just sort of technically beautiful and precise. There's a lot of amazing photographers who have perfected the craft, but works that really sustain a concept, an idea, an emotion. And it's that kind of marriage of form and content, which is a very old art history thing, but I think it still really holds true. And so that's sort of what guided me. And then a lot of it is just the immediate response to an image. We are all we're image-based creatures. So I wanted to now kind of go through, as you probably all know, the exhibition was organized, or the submissions call for entry into 4 different categories. I think it was an interesting, black and white and color, everybody kind of knows, but manipulated and alternative, it's sort of become very fuzzy, and at some level, all photographs are manipulated, they're made, they're crafted, they're thought of. And, you know, alternative is this very loose definition these days. So it was kind of fun to see. And occasionally I wanted one photographer to have been in another category, because the other thing that came out is that the vast majority of submissions were in color. And then I think black and white, and then I think alternative, and then I think manipulated, might have the last two. I was asked to also select a kind of proportional number of works to submissions, which was a good thing. Otherwise, we might have ended up all with, you know, alternative processes in the show, just based on my biases. I thought I would go through them. And the other thing I thought about, you know, and really in retrospect, was also how these different categories actually, you know, what comes to the fore. And that really is about artists' choice of materials and the materials they choose to use to express the ideas they have. So, you know, and I'm not going to show every work. I've tried to include each one that sort of got a special mention in here, but I just thought I'd bring up, you know, some other works that really struck me. And I'll begin with black and white because it's sort of what we're most familiar with, I think, in the history of photography. Up until the mid to late 20th century, it was the sort of dominant form of photography from the 1870s, really. You know, one of the great things about black and white photography is that you have an incredible ability to wrest detail out of a tonal range, and taking away color helps you focus on other things. And in this work, which I haven't, the other thing I should say, and it's a debatable point, none of these works actually came with an artist statement. So I had to kind of, and they were submitted anonymously, so I had to kind of grapple sometimes with, I'm not really sure what the title alludes to, and in future exhibitions it might be worth having an artist statement, other than that probably reduces the, you know, the anonymity, but sometimes it's really hard to understand. But this was one of those where I wasn't quite sure how the title informed the work, but I just loved the kind of animated, anthropomorphic sort of sense of these you know, plants becoming like some sort of, you know, monstrous object. So it struck me, and the contrast here, of course, between the flat road and that linear, you know, sort of human-made mark making versus the kind of mark making of nature. You know, you have the power line. So on sort of a formal level, but it also spoke to me about some sort of, you know, kind of energy from the earth, and I think the title itself, you know, suggests something like that. And then this was a work that also, for me, brings up one of the other challenges of judging these exhibitions online, because you know, it makes things very easy, right? You can review 600 or 700 works of art, but looking at everything on a screen, unless it's produced for a screen, it is kind of the great equalizer, or maybe the great flattener. And one thing that doesn't really come out is often, you know, you don't get a sense of scale, you don't get a sense of luminosity, the detail isn't held, the way your monitor shows or doesn't show color or tone, the object quality of a work of art. So I know for sure there were works that I overlooked because they didn't translate, you know, well on the screen. And this was one of those that I sort of saw the potential in on my screen, but actually in person, this is a really, truly exquisite print. And again here, you know, I think my interest in the southern landscape, you'll kind of see this over and over again, but just really a work of art that to me also brings back the kind of history of photography. We see photographs like this in the late 19th century, particularly with those sort of branches coming down, you know, in this silhouette. And this tension, this sort of push and pull between looking into deep space and this overall kind of flocking and patterning of light. And it, you know, this sort of immersive, beautiful, delicate print, I think really is something that, you know, if we tried to imagine the scene in color, it would be completely different. And so this, to me, was an example of sort of the the wondrous beauty of black and white, the subtlety of these silvers and these tonal ranges. And again, that's always a kind of surprise when you show up to see a work in person after you've seen it online. Occasionally they disappoint, and occasionally they are, they thrill. And then, I was really also drawn to several works by this artist, probably because, I am thinking about sort of the history of the South and of, its pictorial history, its cultural history, and this artist who I met last night is as well. But, I kind of loved just the way here that we see, it's kind of the sunlight going through this transparent veil, and it's really about seeing and not seeing, and that to me is also kind of a metaphor for photography, what it discloses and also what it hides. And that is not just kind of pictorially here, but also kind of a sense of the individual, and this question of portraiture as well, and what are the camera's relationship to subjects is one that I'll bring up a little bit. But I just thought it was also a sort of compelling image. I kept looking at, again and again, where the figure seems to turn into a kind of a scarecrow and back and forth. And then this picture really struck me because I like weird pictures too. And I, thought about this picture, again, here the question of using black and white. I mean, if you think cheerleader, like I think blonde and color and red. And so, there's this decision here to put everything into a pretty, narrow slice of grays here. And we are also very distant, from this young woman. She seems completely isolated. What is she doing against this sort of ominous brick wall? I mean, if you look at the shadow that she casts, it's almost like this sort of monstrous double shadow. And this sort of awkward posture and this distance. And so I think what I really, really liked about this picture was the way that it sort of made strange the whole idea of sort of, what we think of a cheerleader is. And that it, is kind of looking at the awkwardness of youth, some sense of sort of alienation, and, a kind of, I think, a subtle commentary on alienation in youth culture and sort of American culture. It's one of those pictures that stayed with me after I sort of finished judging and I thought about it. And again, I do like pictures that sort of try to not just find the beauty in the world, but also sort of look for those experiences that we have, of distance, of alienation, of strangeness, and put an image to them and help kind of convey often the isolation that we feel. And then this was a picture too that it stayed with me for a number of reasons. I think when I saw this, I was really also thinking a lot about the last year and a half, and about the combined crisis of COVID, sort of politics around, particularly around immigration, and this young man who's a field worker is wearing this kind of strange transparent mask. It's not a mask to protect him from COVID. It's a mask, I'm assuming, to protect him from possibly, insects, heat, I'm not entirely sure, sun. But I thought too that this was one of the few pictures that, and it was surprising to me, because usually there's a lot more in an exhibition or entry like this, that really was also about the power of photography to kind of be a call to action, a witness, a documentation. There really wasn't a lot of documentary photography that was entered. There were some, but this was a piece that stayed with me, because also it seemed to me that beyond a particular moment, and I think this picture is about, labor and how we enjoy the fruits of other people's labor, or in this case, the lettuces, I think. It's about sort of class, immigration. It's about also identity, and about what the photographer's relationship to the subject is here. And that's the final thing about the mask. I thought about, when a photographer takes a picture of another person, there's always a kind of relationship at play. And it's a relationship that's established and negotiated between two people. And to me, the decision, whether it was his or the photographer's, to keep on that mask really suggested a kind of resistance to the gaze as well. And so that picture, I think, stayed with me for all of these reasons. And it just makes me think, more broadly about the kind of ways in which we use photography to document, to witness, to call people to action. But even within that act, it's always a little bit, we're structuring a narrative in a situation. And to have, a sense of resistance of a subject, I think, is really interesting in this picture. Okay. That's my jaunt through black and white. And if your picture didn't show up on the screen, it was just because I did this late last night and I wasn't sure how long it would take me to get through it all. Manipulated, or manipulations, I'm not sure which it was. So this was a category that it was really interesting to see the range of work that was submitted in it, because some things were very obviously like collaged or using a lot of kind of Photoshop to create a sort of sense of unreality. It was very clearly, there was one picture that was so much about a dialogue with a certain kind of 19th century realist painting. But then other people thought of manipulation as something really quite subtle, and just as an aspect of their practice, that those works could have easily been in black and white or color or whatever. So it was interesting to see who submitted what. This picture is unfortunately one that doesn't translate well to the screen, which is kind of funny because it's really actually about the translation of pictures to screens. And it's a sort of this close-up, photograph of a mouth which sort of disappears or dissolves, into the like little pixelated images. And to me, it's about the actual ways in which, these images that we take as representations of real objects are constructs, and they're, increasingly digital constructs. But also the fact that it's this sort of luscious mouth. And so, it's the kind of image that you would see in advertising to kind of entice us, to convey a sense of sort of sexiness and femininity, but kind of going in deeper and deeper and deeper, you're looking at the really constructed nature of photography itself, and maybe also of advertising and of desire. And so that seemed to me the concept or the idea behind this work. And then, this was sort of on the other spectrum of using sort of manipulation to create a very kind of cinematic and enigmatic work of art. And I really have no idea what's going on here. I looked up the artist last night. It's part of a whole sort of science fiction-based series on cosmonauts. I'll fully admit that sometimes I have a hard time with, sort of photography that really isn't like about photography. I'm kind of an old school, curator, and a lot of the work that I respond to is sort of photographers who really think about photography as a craft and as a history. And I really wasn't quite sure where that fit in here. And then I realized I didn't actually care, because I liked where the picture was taking me into a kind of space where I stopped really thinking about what was manipulated and what wasn't. And, the narrative, this sort of elusive narrative here, this kind of fantasy, sort of a 1950s or 60s fantasy of going into the future, a very kind of also like masculine white male fantasy. Anyway, that was one of the works that I enjoyed. This was really on the other end of the sort of manipulation, and one where I sort of, even have a question to the extent in which the work, how it's made, I'd like to know. But it's, and then again, I looked this up last night, it's part of a larger series that the artist did, really about commenting on kind of constructions of beauty in consumer culture, and overlaying image and text in this way, but in this sort of transparent planes, so that we're not really actually seeing a person, we're seeing a set of ideas or concepts or things that were being sold. I thought, too, the form of the portrait itself, which really does look back to kind of 19th century models, just the neck up, it's very simplified, was really a sort of an appealing basis for this kind of commentary, because it's almost like taking this blank slate, and this work is sort of about our projections, onto beauty. And then this work, very different in tone, and I think this is the one that maybe won the prize for manipulation. So as you can see, just dialing back a little bit, I showed you like 4 totally different, completely different approaches to what manipulation is. So I could have shown you probably 7 more, all different. And I think what's great about it is it really reveals the kind of creativity in contemporary photographic practice, that, we are a long way from everything has to be the perfect, zone system, black and white print. But I really like this work. I'm sure it is also because it is about family. It is about like labor and domesticity. I just immediately assumed that a woman made this, and then I had to kind of test my own assumptions, because the picture itself has this sort of actual embroidery on it. So you're looking at a found photograph, and then it is overlaid onto a photograph of, I think it's a photograph of sort of embroidery, and then it's been embroidered over it. But it's this combination of sort of creating a mark onto the past, and of using materials in these new ways. The title itself, it tells a little bit of a story. I don't actually know what the story is behind this, but immediately the title is important here, because you see this picture of kind of joy and togetherness, but then you see a rupture onto the surface of the picture, and that 4 did not return. And then you look and you think, is it the 4 in there? Do I know who the 4 is? What happened to them? Was it war? Was it something else? And so, the picture discloses kind of its meaning slowly, but it does so through its form. And so to me, it was kind of a powerful work of art that stayed with me and made me think too. And we'll get back to this at the very end. Also about photography's role in constructing memory, but also photography as an object, not just, we take a picture and we think it's sort of a visual form of a memory, but it actually becomes an object that circulates, and those memories change. They can be found by other people, reused. So, this thing that we think is a very personal memory actually becomes a kind of cipher or a form of projection for other people. And that's another interest of mine too, is how what happens to all the pictures that we make. I just had this very, I spent last week in Los Angeles with my mother, who's 81, and really needs to clean out her house that she's been in for 47 years. And of course, I got caught up in all of these pictures of people I didn't know, and what do I do with them, and who are they, and what happens to these next. And I think, we all face this. And artists who kind of honor, this question of the orphaned picture and bring them back to life in new ways, I really like that. Some people may find that to be inappropriate, but I love the idea that, photography lives on for new families and new people and new meanings. Okay, alternative. So again, this is one of those phrases that, for a long time meant you weren't making black and white or color. You were doing something else. Maybe you were doing sort of historic processes. And I think more broadly in the field of contemporary practice, we've seen a real return to so-called alternative processes really since about 2000. I think the rise of sort of digital image capture and printing has meant a kind of corresponding embrace of the handmade and the handworked. But that's not to say it's either or. I think some of the most exciting artists working with so-called alternative processes are also, using digital processes, or they're making things by hand and they're scanning the negatives and then they're printing that. So this sort of divide between digital and non-digital, I think, is really not actually useful as a category anymore. But I also just love older processes. I'm not a photographer myself, but when I started working as a curator, I focused on the 19th century to start with, and realized that I needed to actually know how to do some of these processes in order to understand what I was seeing and to understand the labor involved. So I took some classes and made wet plate and tintype and photogravure, and I never got to tricolor gum bichromate because it is so freaking difficult, and it's multiple steps. And when I saw this work, I thought about the decision to go through that to get a picture like this and what was important to the artist. And it's a multi-step process. It's basically combining photography and printmaking, and it's laying over multiple colors. And at one point I could tell you the precise definition, but it was used frequently by artists in the early 20th century, particularly somebody like Gertrude Sabir, one of the leading women artists, as a way to bring depth and color into photography. But it was also a moment of sort of debate between straight photography and so-called pictorialist photography. So the evidence of mark making and of the artist's hand was really valued by artists like Sabir or Stieglitz before he changed his mind 15 years later and then rejected pictorialism completely. So to see a young artist kind of embracing these really labor-intensive older practices intrigued me. But I also just, really was intrigued by the image itself. I mean, it is, again, about kind of gender and femininity, I think, here. So it's probably something I was drawn to. But the surfaces of these prints, to me, are very, very beautiful. They look very different than contemporary color prints. And so I encourage you, when you're especially looking at the alternative works in the exhibition, to kind of focus on the quality here. It's very subtle, it's very light, and you get a sense both of the sort of merging of a photographic lens and a hand making this work. And similarly too, cyanotype is probably one of the earliest photographic processes. And the first person to ever make a photo book, Anna Atkins, also one of the first British women photographers, made a series of incredible cyanotypes, mostly photograms of flora, not fauna, in Britain and its colonies. And so when I saw this picture, I thought about this longer history of photography, and especially cyanotype, as merging kind of art and science here. And the way in which cyanotype, otherwise known as blueprints, again, can really focus our attention on form. I just love this picture too because it made me think about a person. It sort of had this sense of animation, of a kind of emotional quality, of tenderness, and maybe a little bit of sort of languid sadness that I really, really liked. And then this is a picture that I have to admit, when I saw it, again, this is one of those ones that doesn't translate so well on the screen. I thought it was printed on fabric, but I believe, looking at it yesterday, that it's actually the emulsion, probably from a SX70, a Polaroid print, that was lifted off and then placed onto a paper support. The kind of this aspect of transfer, and that really transforms it from kind of an image to an object, And that really interested in me because I am always thinking about this tension between photography as an image and photography as an object. But I also loved making SX70s when I was a kid. That was sort of my parents would give me one, and they would tell me not to use too much film because it was really expensive. But, do the thing where you kind of, mess with it or shake it or this or that. And I know there are a number of artists like Lucas Samaras and others who kind of painted on them or done things to them when they're wet, but I've never actually seen an artist lift off the entire emulsion. And it really changes the way that the print looks, because it looks so different on the plastic base than it does here. Here it looks like a piece of delicate fabric or a window. And so to me, this was just about sort of exploring photography, to be able to transform one thing into another, the kind of magic of what photography is. So these were incredible too. And this was a little series made in Georgia by, I guess, a couple. I realized actually later on that I've seen their work in Atlanta. It kind of rang a bell. And just completely, to be totally non-objective, I worked on a big show, Sally Mann, and in which she debuted a lot of tintypes made in the Dismal Swamp, mostly in Virginia. So I love this stuff. But this was also so sort of delicately done, and I really liked the triptych. I believe these were tintypes, although they had a different surface than the other tintypes. So I don't know if anybody knows. But the thing that I like about 19th century photography, and this is a 19th century process, is the way in which, in fact, the very contrasty nature. You don't have the same subtle tonal range as like a gelatin silver print. Creates this almost here like a hallucinatory sense of the merging of sort of water and leaves and sky. You feel completely surrounded, and in this space of sort of intense light and enclosure. And so again, it's thinking about merging the chosen materials with the picture. But it also made me think too about Georgia and about the place I live, and Atlanta as this city that's always kind of reinventing itself and looking to the future. But very close by, there's this sort of landscape which you feel like maybe hasn't changed in hundreds of years. And actually, a lot of really terrible things happen in that landscape. I mean, it's a land, essentially the wealth is built on the backs of enslaved people. And I'm about to go to the Equal Justice Initiative, the museum later, so I'll probably be thinking about this later, but thinking as well about trees too, and about the history of trees in the South. And this really is something that came to me very belatedly in a conversation I had with a scholar at UVA, a black scholar. We looked at the same Sally Mann tree, and his immediate response was that the picture was so ominous that he really, thought about the role of trees in the South, as sort of a legacy for him and his family. And I, looked at it as this beautiful 19th century picture. So that was a really sort of important and jarring moment for me, constantly to realize that we see things with kind of the lenses that we grew up with. And so I've been thinking a lot about trees ever since that conversation. And then here's the other tintype that I loved as well. And one of the things about these is that when you see them on a screen, you could imagine this is the size of a Carlton Watkins or an Ansel Adams. But it's actually like a 3x4 plate. It's small and handheld. The other thing that's wonderful about tintypes is they are the Polaroids of the 19th century. So if you're impatient, you can get your image right on the spot. And if anybody doesn't know, in order to make a work like this, you actually have to bring all your equipment with you into the field. So you bring your camera, which is generally, not handheld, but a camera mounted on the tripod, maybe medium format. You bring your plates, which, despite the name, are not tin. They used to be iron. Now they can be aluminum. And you need to sensitize the plate on site with your chemicals in the dark, right? And then you put it in your little plate holder. Then you make an exposure, and hope that you got your timing right. And then you take it out, and then you develop it. And then you can polish it and you varnish it when you get back to your studio. But it does require a kind of commitment of material and resources and time. And I think the other thing about that is that when you're shooting, whether it's medium or large format film negatives, or you're making alternative processes on the site, you have to be very selective about how you make a photograph, because you don't want to really use all your materials. It probably takes at least a good half hour, if not more, for one image. So you have to think very carefully about what it is that you want to get. And I think here, to me, it was the trees and the shadows and the way that we have both the sense of stillness, but also the little passage of time. And that's the other thing, too. The exposure time for this was probably a few seconds, because it's much slower. The emulsions are slower than what we think of as in film or in digital. And so the sense of layer time, the sense of hand working. If you see in the corners, usually those little silhouettes. It's also where you pick up the plate, and so you don't have the chemicals on it. Sometimes you see the artist's thumbprints. So I'm drawn to these processes for also the indices of labor that went into them and the kind of decisions that an artist made. And again, too, it's just for me kind of grappling with the South as a landscape. And then this work was the last one I wanted to talk about in alternative, could have gone into manipulated. And it's a really visually subtle work, and it's, I believe, intended to be so. And it's an anthotype, and so the photo nerd in me just immediately was like, oh, somebody's making anthotypes. Those are basically photographs made using plant material as the kind of photosensitive material. An artist named Ben Don was making them out of leaves. So there are a couple crazy things about anthotypes. One is that they don't really last long. Whether, I don't know if the artist found some way of kind of creating stability. You're going to have to tell me as the show goes on tour whether the image still exists at the end of a couple months. But it was made from rose petals, and that also gives it the coloration here. But the subject matter, too, and this is part of a larger series, on black trans women who have been victims of violence and murder. And so these really are also about mourning. And so the use of flowers here, too, has a very kind of deliberate sense of, of remembrance of death and of kind of offering flowers, sometimes for people who have been murdered and their bodies have not been found, or their murders have not been found. So this picture is also kind of a memorial. And then the way that we can and can't see the image, the fact that it's sort of elusive and that it's ungraspable, is also part of the meaning of this picture. That it is that she is out of sight and out of reach, and so there's a kind of longing there for a complete image that we can't have, which is also about a longing for somebody or longing for information, a closure. So this to me was one of those pictures where the artist's choice of material was so interesting to me because it was so well thought out for what the artist was trying to do. It was such a kind of marriage of concept and form. Really interesting. Okay, and then color that was the largest category of submission by far. And it should not be surprising because that is really what many, since the 1970s and 80s, most photographers, both serious and in amateur, have made color photographs. And because color is sort of how we experience the world and see it. So when I was thinking about color photography, I did think about artists responding to color, like really making color the driving force of their picture. But it could not only be that for me, because there's a lot of pictures in which people explore color, and they're incredibly beautiful to look at, because like as humans we like color, like we're drawn to color. And I think men and women tend to be drawn to different kinds of colors. There's a whole kind of psychology around color. But for me, the pictures that really worked is where color was also sort of used to expand upon the concept of the work of art. And here, it was this something called a memory motel. Like, what is that? Is that like a hotel for your memories? Do they stay overnight? Or is it like a graveyard? But the memory motel itself was being overtaken by, the growth of this plant, this hedge that is sort of growing over and over again. And that, the memory motel itself will be sort of erased and effaced. And on a more conceptual level, that is also like a thinking about photography itself as a kind of an erasure of memory. As I said before, we think about photographs as being objects of memory, of sort of fixing memory, but I think just as often they disperse memory, or they replace it or erase it, and particularly as they become objects in the world, they shift. So I just love this picture, and the green sort of draws you in, and you see this as one unit, right? You see the hedge is really becoming the sort of the thing that will be the motel. And then on a sort of the opposite side, I thought about artists who use color, almost not against itself, but to really draw us into the subtlety of color. And that's, it's easy to make incredibly bright, saturated images. I see a lot of them. So what I loved about this picture was the quietness of it, and also the strangeness. I think this is your picture, right? Yes. The strangeness of sort of seeing this conjunction of a painting that you expect to see on a wall or in a house, propped up against the parking thing, and its reflection in the water. And the dark coloration, the tonalities within the painting itself are expanded. You see the sort of same yellows, you see the same grays. I don't know if this is intentional, but it was almost like the painting is itself, expanding into the larger image and vice versa. But it also, to me, is a picture about absence too, displacement of the domestic into a non-domestic sphere. And since I'm thinking a lot about domesticity and home and how home is figured in all of these different ways, it spoke to me. And then there are two pictures by this artist where, this one, the yellow shirt drew me in, thinking about color. But really what I was interested in here and in the next picture is this question of a relationship between photographer and subject. How do you establish a relationship of trust? How can you tell when the photographer is intimately, known to the subject? Does it matter the gender of the maker or the photographer or the race? Like, how are all of these very subtle things negotiated in photography? And this picture made me think about a picture that Robert Frank made in San Francisco in 1955, 6, as part of his great project, The Americans, and I'm sorry I didn't throw it up there, but it's a picture that he made in, I think, Dolores Park in the Mission, and it's the one picture he said, basically, like, he felt like maybe he shouldn't have made it. And it's of a couple, and it's of a black couple, and he's behind them, and he's coming up on them, and they both turn around and they look at him with this sort of intensity of a gaze. And it's kind of confronting the predatory nature of photography. And what he captured in the picture was that exchange. And I think a little bit about that with this picture. I don't think it's quite as intense and confrontational, but just like the picture with Francisco wearing that sort of mask, I think about this subject as being very self-possessed and holding back, part of himself. And what he experiences behind the camera and how that shapes this dynamic. And the same artist made this picture, and I see it, a very different. What I love about this picture is the kind of relationships between these teens, but also we have a very different sense of kind of their comfort before the camera and their comfort with each other. And we have, one person looking out too, which I think is really interesting. 3 very attuned to being photographed and what it means to be photographed and by whom, and then one looking out. So more broadly, I think when we look at pictures of other people, as humans, we're completely fascinated by them, in part because they give us a kind of intimacy that we might not have in person, right? We can stare at a picture and get close to somebody, and there's a pleasure in that. I wasn't going to bring it well. But there's also always ways in which the act of making that picture is fraught. Domesticity. And when I saw this picture, I realized that I had thought so much about sort of quietness and home and domesticity as a female space. And a lot of my work has been around that, around motherhood, and we've seen a lot of photo projects in the last year during the pandemic about lockdown, and they've really focused on women and children or motherhood. And then I saw this picture and I thought, well, men are just as immersed in a domestic space as women, and why didn't I kind of attend to that earlier? And this picture just made me think about that. It's sort of just about the sort of personal experience, care, grooming, and the sort of indices of daily life in the home from a male perspective. So that was a little bit about confronting some of my own biases. And I love this picture, not in the least because this very thing happened the morning, I guess it was yesterday morning, before I drove down to Montgomery, because my kids never close the little, they open up, they grab some blueberries, and they don't close it, and then I open the fridge, and it all comes out. So it's an experience that, many of us had. And it's really not a big deal, but it is kind of a big deal if you're in the wrong mood. And to me, this picture really was about the small daily tragedies. And it's just spilled blueberries, but it also feels like, somebody died. And so I kind of let, the ability to sort of get this. But also the other thing, too, is that the perspective that we're assuming here is on the ground. And so there are a couple possibilities. One is that it's the perspective of a child, like, oh, crap. Or it's of somebody who just cannot take it anymore and just slides to the ground and is like, And so, and to me, the picture vacillates between those. Obviously, I bring a lot of personal experience to this picture. So you can see exactly, how biased and judging really is. But it's also a great picture. And then this, I think, too, was as part of a series the artist did on aging and intimacy, and to me this was incredibly beautiful and tender, and shows a side of aging that we really don't see in Hollywood, in most commercial arenas. And the sort of vulnerability, too, of the couple before the camera really was startling to me, and made me think, too, about that question of the photographer's relationship to the subject, the amount of trust, but also our kind of how photography can give us this gift of being intimate with strangers, of being able to imagine and experience something, like this. And, to me, there's a sort of a longing and a desire in there and a beauty. So I just thought it was a really, powerful picture for that sense. And then this is the last picture. And, I guess in the end, this wraps up a lot of maybe different threads that I've ambled on about today. But the picture is also really about what photography is and like what it means and what it can do. And we're looking at an artist who has gone through her father's slides from the family and is trying to imagine and reconstruct a life. But of course, photography is an imperfect substitute for experience. It really is. It's a thing. And then we can see here how it actually is a thing. This is a technology now that most of us don't have even the slide viewer, so we kind of hold it up and we try to imagine what it looked like. I just did this last week. I found all these slides. And so she's juxtaposed, of course, the past and the present, and she's juxtaposing different forms of photography, different ways in which we try to make sense of the world and ourselves in the past through this very amazing and ever-changing kind of technology of image making. I thought it was a nice way to kind of also end the talk about photography. Right. Well, sometimes it matters and sometimes it doesn't, and I think that is for the artist to decide. But it's just sort of one of the challenges of not having a kind of fuller understanding of maybe what a project is about. And so when I see a title that looks like it might actually help me understand what the artist is doing, I try to sit with it and work it. But more broadly, I think all MFA students now are taught like you can't just make a good picture. You have to have a project. And you have to have a statement, and that is now sort of baked into our expectations around photography. Some pictures need titles, some don't. I mean, the picture of the couple, you don't really need a title to know what it's about. So it's not like everything has to have titles. And if you try too hard, titles are really hard. Like, if you ever try to write a title for a catalog or essay or a book or work of art, it can often fall flat. So I think it's just if there is a title that is like nuns, witches, and the KKK, and I'm looking at this picture, I'm like, I would like to know. So, but that really is more, I think, just a function of how this judging works rather than any commentary more broadly on. The pictures that translate well on the screen and kind of immediately grab you, tend to rise to the fore in works that may be much more layered and complex, but not disclose sort of, right away, tend to get lost. I don't really know any way around that because, you can't have 800 pieces brought to a gallery and then, take 700 away. Usually the no's are, I've seen this image too many times, and and it's fine, but there's a lot of sort of like nature photography and architectural photography I just don't respond to. So I just, like, for me, that's a no. It's the maybes that are hard, and it depends on how well it appears and what you're thinking about and how it responds. So I would say from my own experience, your best chance of success is figuring out who the juror is and what they like. Like, you can look at the shows I've done, and I mean, that sounds bad, and you should submit your best work, but if I'm being honest, it is like, your work is going to appeal to some people immensely, and other people are going to look right past it, and that is, if everybody always looks past your work, then maybe that's about your work. If some people love it and other people don't, that's just how, humans are and how we are. So, but yes, I do have regrets, and if I looked at all the maybes now, I'd probably be like, why did I put that one in and not that one? Can't go back, so. I think people first tend to submit the best work they've done in the last 3 or 4 years. So I think there was a mix of work here. It wasn't all recent. That being said, there was a lot of subtle COVID related. I mean, some people had titles, like masks, whatever. And there was more work about isolation, about home, maybe a little bit more about children, like raising kids. So possibly, it's a little hard to tell on this. I do know in the broader kind of, contemporary artist world, a number of artists who've really shifted their practice in the last year and a half. There's a show up right now at SF MoMA, I think it's like Closer to Home or something like that. It really was all work produced during the pandemic. Another photographer whose work is very strong, Rania Matar, did this whole series. She does portraiture, and all of a sudden she couldn't get close to people. Series Through Windows, and it's actually an incredible series, and it's all about sort of distance and isolation. So I think that what we'll see in a couple of years is how this has really inflected art practice, but it takes a little while for that to kind of appear.
This event has been made possible by grants from the Alabama State Council on the Arts and the National Endowment for the Arts, a federal agency.